Well, I guess partly, like most people, I use social media socially. I used it as a way of connecting with friends. But I must say that Facebook and Twitter are very different, and I found that Facebook was a way to communicate with friends, and Twitter for me was always, I saw it more as a place to connect professionally and as a way to think about different communities for research and different ways of communicating about your research. So I currently use two social media platforms mainly in terms of professional work. One of the interesting things about Facebook is that when I initially joined Facebook, that really was a place to connect with friends, and increasingly there are a group of historians who are connecting on Facebook. And so I am friends on Facebook with a lot of historians who I've never actually met in person, some of them, but who I now have this kind of Facebook friendship with. And there are a lot of historians on Facebook kind of connecting in that way, which I think is very interesting. Twitter is the other platform that I use, and I find Twitter is a slightly different form of communication. It's much briefer, it's much more link-based. You need to be able to kind of link to something that you are communicating with someone else, or a way to promote things that you're trying to get out there. But Twitter and Facebook are the main ones that I use. I use social media to promote things that I've done. So in terms of communicating research, it was like, my radio program is coming up this Sunday, tune in. And so what was interesting about that was that the program itself also had a social media kind of like buttons, so people could hit that and then like it on Facebook, or they could hit it and tweet about it and stuff like that. So what was really interesting in the wash up of that was being able to communicate with those people on Twitter and say, thanks so much, did you know X? So it was a really interesting way to communicate with people I would never otherwise have talked to. And it had some concrete effects too, that after the program went to air, there was a policy group that publishes archived policy documents online, contacted me and said, is this Royal Commission available anywhere? And I said, no, it's not. You should scan it and put it up for people to read. And so they did that, and then they tweeted about that, and they tweeted about the program. And so there are things like that that you wouldn't necessarily rely on it as your primary form of disseminating your work. I mean, I know some people blog, and then they tweet about their blog posts as a way of sort of generating traffic to the blog. And I find blogging a bit time consuming. I think I tried it and it was a bit time consuming to sort of keep it up. But I think as a way of saying, here's something I did, let's talk about it, then that's really effective. I think it can be really effective. Well, one of the interesting things about Twitter is that there were a group of historians that got on there very early and created this hashtag Twitterstorians. And so there's this idea now that the Twitterstorians is a hashtag that you apply to something that you tweet about that relates to the historical profession, either in a very general, broad way or a very specific way. And so I think what it's provided is a really great sense of community, and it can be, although I haven't necessarily found this yet, but it can be a way to find other researchers working in your area. I know some people use that hashtag when they can't get access to a journal article, for example, in their library, their institution. They say, hey, Twitterstorians, can anyone get this journal? And so there are kind of lots of interesting cross-institutional connections that you might not otherwise make. Also a way I think that a lot of early career researchers are much more active on social media than established researchers. But I think opportunities like following the journals that you like and editors of journals that you like, that's where you find out about special issues long before, the kind of grinding processes of emailing and things like that kind of can communicate those things out there. So it can be a way to follow new publications, to get on top of things before other people perhaps know about them. And I think it is a way for a history community to feel like a history community. So one of the things I find useful about Twitter is that it connects me as an academic with people working in historic museums, people working in government, people working in policy, archives. And because Twitter is so curated, you can really create the community that you want. I have an incredibly diverse set of people who I can communicate with on Twitter. And when I was, for example, working on a campaign to try and publicise the ABC's plans to close a history radio program, I mean, that got so much Twitter kind of circulation because I was communicating with people from all different places about this particular matter that was of particular interest to historians in all kinds of places. So it's a way of realising how big the history community is, how potentially there are lots of avenues for your research and also for your career path that you might not think about if you're just sitting in an academic department. If you're suddenly on Twitter, the world opens up, I think, in some ways. Yeah, I have several colleagues in the department, early career researchers, quite senior people who are all active on Twitter, and sometimes, you know, they tweet about the football as well as tweeting about, you know, their research. But, you know, I've once heard Katrina Gulliver, who was the person that coined this term, Twitterstorians, and she said, I think it's important to sort of tweet about your life, you know, that there is something about not just being an automaton that just tweets about their research, that gives, people want to follow that. People want a sort of sense of like, oh, what's going on in that person's life as well as, you know, what's going on in their research. I'm not quite sure about that. I do tend to sort of keep them a bit separate, but I think that there is something interesting in that idea that little glimpses of the life behind the researcher is sort of interesting and makes Twitter a richer place. Probably the biggest risk of communicating via social media and kind of, you know, is using it to vent your spleen about various things. There's a whole kind of subgroup of people on Twitter who post stupid comments that their students have made in assignments and stuff like that. And I kind of think that humiliating students, even if it's anonymous, you know, they're obviously not using their students' names. I don't know if that's quite, you know, I mean, I can see why people do it, but I don't think it's probably a very great, it's not a really ideal use of social media to kind of humiliate or belittle other people. I think there is that question of blurring of boundaries that can be tricky. If you're a PhD student and your supervisor is on Twitter and you're following each other on Twitter, you know, there is a certain guardedness I think that both sides have to manage in that, in making sure that, you know, they keep that relationship professional and all those things. The last big conference I went to of my discipline was in 2012, and that was when the Twitter thing was just starting to take off, and they did a kind of, let's all meet up, the Twitterstorians will meet up at this conference. And so I didn't go to that, I couldn't make it to that, but I will go to this year's conference, and so I'll be interested to see if it's still the same people or if there is a kind of greater sort of presence around social media, if people are tweeting more about conferences and then, you know, you can say, oh, hey, I've seen you on Twitter, hi, you know, can I meet you, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it is a very weird sort of selected community because a lot of the big names in the historical profession, for example, are not on Twitter. Probably would go, that's not interesting to me. So it tends to skew younger, it tends to skew more towards the postgrad end. And in that case, it's a fantastic community building tool, I think, for postgrads and early career researchers. First, to be following a lot of people and be broadly interested and engaged in the profession in terms of social media. Someone I know from the University of Western Australia is a really great tweeter. She's History Punk, that's her Twitter handle. She has a really great blog. She worked in marketing before she's doing a PhD in history, and she's writing a history that incorporates some of that marketing expertise. And she was the sort of person who would, the reason I met her is she tweeted to me about an article that I'd written. She said, I love that article, I've mentioned that in my latest blog post. And she's cultivated this Twitter kind of, not personality because that implies it's something put on, but this kind of Twitter persona or reputation that is very much about, I'm working within an area of my expertise, but I'm communicating out to other people and drawing them into my conversation. You know, so I think that if you can find the thing that you know more about than anyone else, and you can cultivate a communication strategy, a social media communication that looks for things that relate to that in the public eye, you don't want to pretend to be something that you're not. So I think cultivating expertise in a particular area and being a diligent follower, a retweeter, starting conversations, drawing people in, using social media for what it's good at, which is making connections and being social. That's the way I think to kind of cultivate that sort of status. Deciding which social media platform you're going to use. I kind of think Twitter might be an easier one for a budding researcher to maintain, because to me it looks like a more professional medium. It's not full of people's baby pictures, and it's, you know, it's a little bit more career focused and public facing focused, I think. I think you've got to be prepared to put a little bit of time into it, to put some of your persona into it. Don't just be, you know, a robot tweeting stuff about other people's research that you like. Make it genuine, I think, because I think people see through sort of fakery. It's sort of, you've got to be genuine and think about what it is that you have to offer that no other researcher does, And when that moment comes along, which will come along, that opportunity where you see something happening in public that you think you should contribute to, think about writing an op-ed piece for something like The Conversation, because The Conversation is very broad in terms of what it accepts. It's not like, there's no gatekeepers as much as something like the Sydney Morning Herald. They're very generous in what they'll publish because that's their point, is to kind of publish academic work in a public forum. So, think about kind of doing that stuff and be prepared to put a little bit of time aside if you need to do that. But I just think have a go. And, some people will feel like, oh, it's not for me. I don't want to be trolled and I don't want to, kind of deal with people's anger. But I think we all have a certain responsibility to communicate what we know in a broader public audience, because the taxpayer pays for a lot of what we do. And I do feel like we have a certain responsibility to kind of make sure that people see that what we are doing is useful and valuable. And that doesn't mean utilitarian, it just means that you have something to contribute to the conversation, work out what that is and have a go.